My name is David Walker. I'm 34 years old and an investigative journalist. I have explored many abandoned places, unraveling urban legends and debunking stories that seem supernatural. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts or curses, at least not until that night at the Pension Lorraine. New Orleans is a city where the past never dies. The French Quarter is a tapestry of history and mystery. Every corner, every old building seems to hold secrets in its shadows. And among them, Pension Lorraine stood out. Abandoned since the 19th century, it is said to still be inhabited by the echoes of its former owner and the guests who never left. I parked the car on a quiet, narrow street. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of damp earth and a little too sweet for comfort. The full moon was hidden by dense clouds, casting an oppressive darkness over the two-story building in front of me. The facade of the guest house was deteriorated with broken windows and rotting wood. The flashlight light trembled in my hand as I approached the double wooden doors. Engraved on the sign above in worn letters, it read, Pension Lorraine. "Come on, David. It's just another old building," I muttered to myself, trying to dispel the shiver running up my spine. I pushed the door open and it opened with a prolonged creak, as if signaling that I was not welcome. The lobby was a vision frozen in time. Dusty armchairs were arranged around a tea table, with cracked glasses still in their places. A winding staircase led to the second floor, its boards creaking under the weight of the past. I took a few steps inside, and the door closed behind me with a loud bang. My heart raced, but I tried to stay calm. I took a deep breath and focused on the mission, finding something concrete for the article. Some logical explanation for the reports of whispers and the rope marks on visitors' wrists. The flashlight illuminated the environment in unstable beams. The shadows seemed to dance around me, forming crooked figures that disappeared when I turned. A marble sculpture in the corner of the lobby, a blindfolded female figure, seemed to be watching me. I climbed the first steps of the stairs. Each step was accompanied by a groan of ancient wood. The silence was alive, pulsing around me. When I reached the top, a soft whisper broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." My muscles contracted. The flashlight shook in my hand. I turned in every direction, but the hallway was empty. Just closed doors and peeling wallpaper. "Focus, David," I murmured. I chose the nearest door and pushed it open. It was a guest room, frozen in time. A bed with yellowed sheets, a dresser covered in dust, and a cracked mirror. I approached the mirror, observing my distorted reflection. For a moment I thought I saw another figure beside me, a woman with a pale face and empty eyes. I blinked, and she disappeared. A cold draft blew through the room, and the mirror made a sharp crack. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. A scratching sound began to echo from the wall behind the bed. Approaching cautiously, I pulled away the peeling wallpaper. Below, words were scratched into the wood as if someone had used fingernails or a knife. "She's still here." My throat dried up. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I felt pressure on my wrists as if invisible hands were holding them tightly. I looked down and saw red marks appearing on my skin. I pulled my arms back, fighting something I couldn't see. "Let go of me," I shouted. The pressure disappeared. I breathed heavily, fear taking over me. I turned to run, but the bedroom door closed on its own with a bang. The whisper came again, closer this time, hissing in my ear. "You are the next guest." The flashlight light went out. Panic gripped me. My fingers shook as I tried to turn the flashlight back on. When the light came back on, I saw for a split second the reflection of a woman in a dark dress, smiling with chapped lips and empty eyes. The flashlight fell out of my hand. With a desperate effort, I ran towards the door and threw it open. The hallway seemed darker than before. I stumbled down the stairs, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on me. When I finally reached the exit door, I pushed it open and ran out into the street. The cold night air enveloped me like a hug of relief. I looked back. The windows of the boarding house were dark, but I could have sworn a silhouette was standing on the second floor watching. I knew it wasn't over. Lorraine Pension still had guests, and maybe soon I would be one of them. The cold of the street enveloped me, but it wasn't enough to calm my racing heart. The dark windows of the Lorraine Pension watched me. I should leave, but something was holding me back. An invisible force, An unanswered question. My mind screamed to run, but my legs had other plans. I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and went back inside. The door creaked shut behind me with a dry snap. The air was heavier. Each step on the floor creaked, as if the building were alive and aware of my presence. The flashlight trembled in my hand, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. I climbed the stairs. At the top, the hallway was darker and longer. A door at the end was ajar, a faint light leaking through it. I took a deep breath and approached it. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. It was a different room. The four-poster bed was intact, the sheets crisp and white. An antique dressing table glowed in the light of a nearly extinguished candle. In the mirror, I saw my reflection, but I was not alone. Madame Lorraine stood behind me. I turned abruptly. She stood there, dressed in black, her face pale, her eyes empty as bottomless wells. A cold smile curved her cracked lips. "You're back to stay," she whispered. My legs were trapped. I tried to run, but an invisible pressure held my ankles. My wrists burned as if invisible ropes were squeezing them. "Why?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "My guests never leave," she replied, her voice sweet and rotten. The candle went out. The room plunged into darkness. A buzzing sound filled my ears, followed by whispers in several voices, all pleading for help. The pressure increased in my wrists. The bed seemed to beckon to me like an open grave waiting to be filled. With all my strength, I pulled my legs up. The invisible bonds gave way. I ran for the door, stumbling over furniture. Madame Lorraine slid across the floor behind me, her face contorted in rage. "You can't escape," she screamed. I ran down the stairs, the steps creaking like bones breaking. The walls seemed to close in, doors slamming shut around me. I reached the entrance and slammed my shoulder into the door. It didn't budge. Madame Lorraine was close. The air turned frigid, the smell of decay filling my nostrils. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door again. It swung open. I fell to the cold sidewalk. The sound of the door closing echoed like thunder. Gasping, I looked back. The windows were dark, but on the second floor, a silhouette watched me. Madame Lorraine's smile visible even in the shadows. I stood up shakily. My hands still had red marks on my wrists. She had almost trapped me. I walked away, each step heavier. The boarding house seemed to be watching me until I turned the corner. I knew it wasn't over. The Lorraine boarding house was still waiting for new guests, and I had barely escaped. My name is Rachel Green. I'm 32 years old and have been a private researcher for almost a decade. I've worked on cases of disappearances, fraud, and urban mysteries. I've always been skeptical. I have always believed that behind any bizarre event there is a logical explanation. Or at least he believed so until he set foot on that farm in the middle of nowhere in rural Kansas. The McAllister family disappeared 2 weeks ago. John and Margaret McAllister, along with their 2 children, simply evaporated. When the local sheriff called me to investigate, he just said, "There's something strange there, Rachel, something we don't understand." Now I was there in front of the old farm. The sunset light tinted everything in shades of red and gold, casting long, distorted shadows. The wind blew through the cornfields, making the leaves rustle like ancient voices. The main house was in front of me, 2 stories of worn wood and broken windows. But what really caught my attention were the scarecrows scattered across the fields. There were at least a dozen of them, positioned irregularly. They seemed to be looking at the house. Something about those scarecrows made me shudder. I stopped in front of the porch, the rotten wood creaking beneath my feet. I pushed the door, which slowly opened with a prolonged groan. The interior was frozen in time. Plates of food were still on the kitchen table, covered in mold. The chairs were turned over, as if the family had left in a hurry. "McAllisters?" I called, knowing there would be no answer. The only response was heavy, oppressive silence. I climbed the stairs, the steps creaking in protest. In the master bedroom, I found a messy bed and a journal on the nightstand. The cover was worn and the pages were yellowed. I sat on the edge of the bed and started leafing through. The first pages were normal, records of the farm's daily life. but as I progressed, the writing became more frantic. John McAllister was talking about an ancient covenant, a tradition to ensure good harvests. He mentioned something about scarecrows that needed to be respected. The last pages were torn out. A shiver ran down my spine. I closed the diary and left the room. As I passed through the hallway, I saw something through the window that made me stop. One of the scarecrows had changed position. Before, he was in the middle of the field. Now I was at the edge of the cornfield, facing the house. His cloth face, sewn with black threads, seemed to stare at me. "It must be the wind," I muttered, trying to ignore the fear rising in my chest. I went downstairs and out into the backyard. The sun was almost disappearing over the horizon, casting a gloom over the farm. I walked to the edge of the cornfield. The scarecrow was just a few meters away from me. His clothes were old and tattered, but there was something about his straw arms, something almost human. I approached slowly. A draft of cold air swept past me, and the smell of damp earth intensified. I reached out to touch the scarecrow, but something stopped me. The surrounding shadows seemed thicker, as if the field itself was holding its breath. A whisper came from the cornfield. "You shouldn't be here." My heart raced. I turned the flashlight onto the field, but there was no one there. Just rows and rows of corn, swaying gently in the wind. I tried to laugh at my own fear, but the sound came out weak. "Okay, Rachel, breathe. That's just your imagination." When I turned to go back to the house, I froze. The scarecrow was now closer. There was no explanation for that. Its button eyes reflected the flashlight light in a sickly way. Its straw arms were outstretched as if it wanted to grab me. I backed away, my entire body screaming to run. But before I could move, I heard another whisper, louder this time. "The harvest needs to be paid for." A sharp crack came from behind me. I turned and saw another scarecrow, slowly climbing out of the cornfield, its wooden feet scraping the ground. More scarecrows began to appear, emerging from the shadows, forming a circle around me. Panic gripped me. I ran toward the house, my feet stumbling in the loose dirt. I didn't look back. I could only hear the whispers and the sound of the scarecrows moving. When I reached the porch, I threw myself inside and slammed the door. My breathing was out of control. Silence returned, but I knew I wasn't safe. I looked out the window. The scarecrows were standing in the yard, motionless again. But now they were all facing the house. They were waiting. And I knew the night was just beginning. The silence inside the house was thick, broken only by the sound of my rapid breathing. Outside, the scarecrows remained still, their silhouettes distorted by the shadows of the night. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. They were waiting, and I had no idea what would happen when they decided to move again. My eyes were fixed on the window, watching each straw figure. Their button eyes shone in the moonlight, reflecting a cold, cruel emptiness. My entire body screamed to get out of there, but where to? The cornfield was a dark maze full of ancient secrets. Staying or running seemed like two sides of the same cursed coin. A dry noise came from the back of the house, a slow, rhythmic scratching like nails scraping against wood. My heart raced. I gripped the flashlight tightly and moved toward the sound. Each step was an effort to control the fear that consumed me. I reached the kitchen. The back door was ajar, and a cold wind blew in, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and rot. The light from my flashlight flickered as I shone it into the doorway. There were dirt footprints on the ground. Not human, but not straw either. I swallowed hard and took a step back. The harvest must be paid for. A drawling voice whispered from every direction. The door swung open with a sharp thud, and something crawled into the house. It was one of the scarecrows. Its straw arms moved with grotesque stiffness, and its stitched head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The ropes that bound it seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. This one was different from the others. It was larger, and its button eyes seemed to burn with an inner light. Every movement it made felt forced, as if it were being controlled by something invisible. I had to get out of here. I ran into the main room, but the scarecrows were already moving, blocking every exit. They were closer now, their shadows lengthening and blending into the darkness of the house. Each step was accompanied by the sound of rustling straw and splintering wood under their impossible weight. A cold panic gripped me. Then I remembered John McAllister's journal. It spoke of a pact and an offering clearing. Perhaps there was a way to break the cycle. I took a deep breath and ran to the front door, dodging the slowly approaching figures. I yanked the door open and ran into the cornfield, the darkness closing in around me. The cornstalks brushed my face, whispering like mocking voices. The scarecrows were behind me, the sound of rustling straw growing louder. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was exactly as described in the journal. A circle of packed earth lit by the full moon. In the center, a rotting wooden altar with symbols scratched into it. On top of the altar, the remains of burned ropes and bones too small to be animals. This was where the sacrifices were made. The scarecrows appeared at the edge of the clearing, forming a circle around me. Their empty eyes glowed with a cold, unforgiving light. "The harvest must be paid," they said in unison, their voices coming from mouths sewn shut. My eyes fixed on the altar. I grabbed the lantern and threw it at the dry wood. The flames flared quickly, licking at the ancient symbols. A scream echoed through the night, not from the scarecrows, but from something deeper, something trapped in this earth for too long. The scarecrows stopped. Their forms trembled and began to crumble, the straw breaking free and burning in the light of the flames. One by one they fell, reduced to ash as the fire consumed the altar. Silence returned, but it was different now. The evil presence had disappeared. The oppressive weight that had suffocated the air had lifted. Panting, I fell to my knees. The clearing was full of ash and a burning smell. I had broken the pact. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. I got up and walked back to the house. Everything was quiet. The shadows seemed less threatening. When I reached the car, I took one last look at the farm. The fields were empty, the scarecrows gone. But I knew that the earth never forgets. Those crops had been paid for in blood for decades. And even though the scarecrows were gone, something told me that the soil was still hungry. My name is Tom Harris. I'm 42 years old, and I've been a truck driver for almost 2 decades. I've driven from one end of the country to the other, through deserted highways and ghost towns. I've seen sandstorms, blizzards, and accidents I'd rather forget. But I've never encountered anything that really scared me. Roads are just that, pieces of asphalt that take you from one point to another. Until now. When I accepted my overnight delivery on Route 666, I didn't pay much attention to the warnings from the locals. They talked about the road as if it were alive, as if it could swallow the unwary. I laughed, thanked them for the tips, and continued on my way. It was midnight when my tires touched the cracked asphalt of Route 666. The sky was covered in heavy clouds and there was no moon, just darkness, and my headlights illuminated the road for a few feet ahead. I turned on the radio to chase away the silence, but all I could hear was low, irritating static. I tried to change the station, but the hissing continued. I huffed and turned off the radio. That was better. I needed to concentrate. The road seemed endless. Miles and miles of empty asphalt, flanked by flat deserts and dry bushes that disappeared into the darkness. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. 0045. The GPS was on, but it didn't seem to help much. The route wasn't updating. The arrow stayed in the same place, as if I wasn't moving. "Damn," I muttered, giving the GPS a light tap. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing but darkness. But for a second, a brief second, I thought I saw something move behind the truck. A tall, dark figure on the side of the road. I blinked and looked again. Nothing. "You're just tired, Tom, that's all." I accelerated a little more. The engine roared. The truck moved forward. The warm wind blew against the cabin, making a low, continuous sound, almost like a whisper. My eyes were heavy, but there was no place to stop. There was nothing on this road but more road. Suddenly, something caught my eye to the right. A small gas station appeared on the horizon. Dim lights illuminated the gas pumps and a convenience store. It was a relief to see something other than the endless desert. I pulled over and got out. The silence was almost palpable. No sound of insects, no wind, just the creak of my footsteps on the asphalt. The store doors were open, but the place looked abandoned. The sign flickered intermittently, a light bulb struggling to stay on. "Is anyone here?" I called, my voice echoing. No answer. I walked into the store. Empty shelves, packages of expired snacks, a thin layer of dust covering everything. I walked up to the counter. An old cash register was open, but no money. Just as I was about to leave, the phone on the counter rang. The sound was like an electric shock going through my body. A phone ringing in a place like this? I swallowed hard and answered. "Hello?" My voice was hoarse. A whispered voice on the other end answered, "Why are you still on the road, Tom?" My heart stopped for a second. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I put the phone back in its cradle and backed away slowly. My hands were sweaty. I looked out of the store. The truck was there, but something seemed wrong. The gas station lights began to flicker and go out. Darkness took over everything. I ran to the truck, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. The headlights came on, illuminating the road. I sighed, trying to calm my heartbeat. I put the truck in drive and drove on. The gas station disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness. But something wasn't right. I drove for another 20 minutes, and to my astonishment, the same gas station appeared again on the right. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. It couldn't be. I had been driving straight ahead. There was no way I could have come back to the same place. No, I muttered. I drove straight past the gas station, fear rising like bile in my throat. I kept driving, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The silence inside the cabin seemed to scream. The GPS was still frozen. The clock on the dashboard read 00:45. It hadn't moved a minute. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a shadowy figure was standing in the middle of the road, motionless, its long arms hanging at its sides. When I looked again, there was nothing. But I knew it was there, and the road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. My eyes burned as I gripped the steering wheel. The clock on the dashboard still read 00:45, and Route 666 stretched like an endless snake in the darkness. My chest felt heavy with a mixture of fear and frustration. This road felt like an endless nightmare. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. This was not the time to panic. I needed to focus. Something wasn't right, but there had to be a logical explanation for all of this. The fatigue. This had to be delirium caused by exhaustion. I had been driving for hours without rest. The human mind is treacherous when deprived of sleep. I had heard stories of truck drivers who had seen impossible things after long journeys. The radio crackled again. The same distorted voice emerged from the static. "You shouldn't be here." I shivered, but this time I took a deep breath and forced a bitter smile. "It's just static," I muttered. "Just static and a tired brain." Suddenly, an idea hit me like a punch. I grabbed my phone and opened the backup GPS I used on complicated trips. The signal was weak, but the route began to load. Instead of showing the same frozen position, the new route indicated something different, a detour a few miles ahead. I stepped on the gas. This might be my only chance to get off this damn road. The headlights illuminated the road, and the cracked asphalt sped past under my wheels. The shadows on the sides of the road still seemed to move, but I ignored them. Whether they were illusions or something else, I couldn't afford to think about it now. Finally, I saw the sign for a detour to the right. It was barely visible, covered in dust and partially fallen, but it was there. Detour 34, alternate route. I turned the wheel firmly and turned onto the new road. The asphalt gave way to a rough gravel track, but a sense of relief began to grow in my chest. The GPS indicated that I was off Route 666. I kept driving. The sky slowly began to lighten. A soft shade of blue appeared on the horizon. The clock on the dashboard finally ticked to 5:30. Time was ticking again. I let out a nervous laugh. It was like a giant weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Route 666 was no longer visible, just a dirt road disappearing into the desert landscape. After another hour of driving, I arrived in a small town. I pulled over at a gas station, got out, and took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. The smell of gasoline and strong coffee was almost comforting. A clerk came out of the convenience store and gave me a curious look. "Long night, huh?" he said, adjusting his cap. "Looks like you saw a ghost." "Almost," I replied, trying to smile. "Did you come from Route 666? He asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "A lot of guys get lost there because of fatigue and sandstorms. The desert can play tricks on your mind. It's easy to panic and think the road is alive." He took a sip of coffee. "But it's just an old, poorly marked road after all." "Just a road," I repeated as if trying to convince myself. He patted me on the shoulder. "Get some rest before you hit the road again. This place messes with your head." I nodded and got back in the truck. Maybe he was right. The combination of extreme fatigue, isolation, and the eerie atmosphere of Route 666 was enough to mess with my mind. The road wasn't alive. There were no shadows chasing anyone. It was just stories and superstition, fed by exhausted truckers like me. But as I turned the key in the ignition, I couldn't help but look one last time at the horizon. The line where the sky met the desert seemed to shimmer, like a mirage. For a second, I thought I saw a dark figure standing there, watching. I shook my head and started the engine. It was just my imagination, or at least that's what I had to believe.